So I think we can actually get started. So welcome everyone to this session. We call it a Q&A session, and the theme here is classification and why it makes a difference. So my name is Annika Svensson. I'm head of marketing here at Symetri, and I'm really happy to welcome our panel on this extremely, I think, interesting topic. And we have Nielsen, we have Keiward Pham, who you also could listen to yesterday, and we have Nicolai Karved. And instead of me making the introductions, I think we should start with Chris. Why don't you introduce yourself, who you are and where you come from, and also why you actually think classification is so important, and a bit how you have used it.
Yes, hello. My name is Chris, and I'm working at the new University Hospital in Odense. We are building a 320,000 square meters building right now, and hopefully we are finished in 2023. And about all the classification part, I think for me, it's like a common language for the virtual softwares. We are trying at our organization to communicate between like 10 or 12 different softwares and different facility management systems, because we have logistic systems and we have the normal facility management systems and so on. So for me, it's important to have the common language or the common code to talk about when we're talking classification. So we don't talk about the same object in two different ways or three different ways. We need to talk about the same object in one way, so we are clear about how to work with it. Yes.
Yeah, I think that sounds really important. And also, is it difficult to get into that, same naming and sort of use the same?
Yes, it's a little bit difficult because we have like 15 different projects that should be merged into one in the finish. And we have different contractors, so I have to synchronize all the data, and that's why the classification code is very important. So we are talking about the same stuff. But the most important part is that we need to get the same way to use. We need to get the same way to use the code. In 2 or 3 different languages, we might see the classification in the 2 different ways. So for me, it's very important to navigate all the contractors to go in the same way. And for me as well, it's very hard sometimes to use the CCS or CCI classification because we have some logistic systems that the CCS or CCI don't have any codes to. So sometimes we can't use the code, and we need to figure out what code is near this object. But we are using the CCS code in our system because the CCI code, classification code, came a little bit later, I think 1 year after we started. But it has some better classification than the CCS in our big system at our hospital. But for me, it's very important for the processing of all the data between every project, the economy and all the time schedules where our big contractors are using the CCS classification code.
Yeah.
So for me, it's all about data and the language. So we have the common goal and the right data to work with.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks. I think it's a really interesting perspective. And Keiward, I mean, you're not coming from the building industry per se at all. But when we had a chat a couple of weeks ago, I mean, you showed a huge interest into classification, the BIM models, and the data that Chris is talking about. And so, what's your view now on classification, and what is it that you're looking for?
Yes, so just to give a very short background. So my name is Keiward Pham. I'm an investment director at Alder. So an Alder is Nordic investment fund, and we look to invest into sustainability companies. And why I think that, and I should also say that we have looked very much into this construction industry overall, and made various investments, both from the installation company phase, in the building automation company, and also into fire engineering and consultancy company. But we think this is very interesting, because BIM classification is really a part of the structural trend and the paradigm shift that is ongoing right now in the construction industry. And we can also see that they are actually need to catch up with all the other industries where this had been transformed. You can see all the massive benefits that can be reaped from this as well. So we certainly see this as a very interesting area from an investment perspective, both in terms of growth, but also in terms of productivity and efficiency improvements in the industry.
Yeah, I think that sounds so in a way, I mean, you're looking at it from, I mean, you're looking for sort of the same kind of data, but from slightly different perspective.
Yes, on a high level.
Yeah. So Nicolai, I mean, you are from Symetri, and I think Chris earlier just talked about, I mean, there are different ways to do the classification and how to use it. Why don't you first introduce yourself, but also give the audience sort of a quick overview on how you can work with it, and sort of, yeah, how it works in real.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my name is Nicolai Karved, and I'm working with Symetri as a consultant for the management part in software development. My history is back from working with Alder for a lot of years, distributing that, and then we have been working on making classification systems and software for that. So that has been my main focus for the past 8 years or something like that. I will try just to do a small introduction to what classification actually is. And some of you, maybe you watched the session yesterday, the panel discussion about disruption. And one of the things that were mentioned was that we need to make sure that the quality of the eye in BIM is achieved. And this is actually what standardizing information is all about. So you can say that, why should we do this? First of all, as Chris also mentioned, it's very important that we make sure that everybody is talking the same language. So you need to make sure that everybody understands. There's a huge demand for reusing data in different ways. This could be for data mining or automation. And in that case, we really need to make sure that the quality and the way that we work with data is the same way all the time. There's a lot of way of actually doing this. Definitely, if we're using different standards for that, we can benefit from it, all of us. We have been kind of standardizing inside different companies, sometimes on a project level, and today we see that we do it more globally. And you can do that in different ways. One of the key things is that you agree on some kind of structure. On the university hospital, it was very early in the stages that they decided which standard they should work on, how they wanted the general contractor to be working on this. So it's very important, and that can ensure that you really get the benefits of this. So when we're talking about data structure, it's mainly about how you structure the data inside the models, or actually also outside the models. So when you have different disciplines that are working in a project, this is often the kind of how we could visualize this. So if the squares are the objects we are talking about, they are kind of a mess. Some software are working with some categories, other softwares are using another kind of way of categorizing this. And on top of that, we add all these different labels. Some of it is classification, some are for working with properties. So the first thing would be that we add some information about the classification, so everybody knows what these different models contains. That makes it possible for Chris to do a class detection across the different files from different file formats, because he knows which kind of objects that he wants to interact with. The next thing would be that we would like to work with these more standardized properties. So it's much easier when you do that, in a way, so you can very easy do a query across the different data you have to figure out which of these doors maybe have this specific fire rating. I'm not going to go into all of these different standards, but there's a lot of international standards. Some of them are implemented, some are new. The IFC part, we've been working with that for the past 15 or 20 years, but that's also a way of doing this. But to understand classification in the built environment, which is the building industry we're working in, is that you need to have some kind of system that can tell you about what is the real life object, so we can identify those inside our projects. And usually it's based on a name, that will be a usual name that we call it in daily terms. And you have a code, and that code could be very different depending on which kind of system you're using. The most important thing, and this is actually the definition, but unfortunately a lot of these systems actually don't have any good definition of what this is. And just to give a few examples of classification codes, kind of more globally. So in the Nordics, we're working with this ISO standard, which is quite new. It's very generic. But if you look into UK or into software like IFC, you will see that we have different ways of defining what a class is. And this is mainly based on two things. This is my last slide. That's because we have mainly two different purposes for classification. One is for the design of the building. So you have generic objects that you work with. You can do that very early in the phases, but then you rely on having properties. And because we in the past didn't have IT for supporting this, we were much more into having these kind of classification systems that we use for specification. And what you do with those kind of systems is that you use them to decompose the actual construction entities. So if a general contractor should find a price on a certain kind of column, he could look up a very complex number on this object, and then he would know that this is a load-bearing steel column in the facade. This is how detailed it sometimes is, but it's very hard when you do the design to actually know if this is going to be a steel column or whatever. So it's very important to say that it's not because some of these systems are wrong or one is better than the other, but they serve different purposes. So I think that's about what I intended to just give kind of a wrap up of what classification actually is.
Thanks, Nicolai. So I see we have quite a few here in the audience, and if you would like now to ask a question to Chris or Nicolai or Keiward or to all of the three of them, you can either type it in the chat, or if you want to, you could access here in the room if you click in the right-hand corner and share your video and your sound, and you can actually ask the question yourselves. So do we have anyone from the audience who'd like to ask a question? Or are you preparing perhaps for some? Chris, I mean, I think you spoke about it before. I mean, in a big project like the Odense Hospital, and actually here in Stockholm, we are next to the Karolinska Hospital, which is also a huge project. I mean, what is what are the values really coming out from, you know, when you get into this, that you actually have the classification and you make all the different parties in the project, you know, to use the same ones? What is the, I mean, you know, I see the value now, but sort of when you will be ready with the project, what will the values be?
In our perspective, we are using the classification like an unique code for every system in our automatic system to our SCADA. So we are actually making our own ID, but with the classification code instead of making our own classification. The problem in the old hospital is that they made their own short code for every system. So some of them was short code for the Danish word, and some of them was short code for the English or something else. So the classification here is able to give us a hand to make the right decision somehow, and not that someone is making their own classification, their own code for the system. And this is not the only system, the SCADA. We have, as I told, mostly 10 or 11 systems that needs to talk with each other. So we need the right way to communicate. And for us, it's very important in the system that we are having the right length of the ID code. So for us, we are using the CCS functional ID. So we know where the component, which technical system the component is in, and what kind of functional system and where it starts. So in that way, we can track down the component.
I see. Yeah.
So it's like the reference designation system in our project. Yes.
Thank you, Chris.
But it takes some time.
Yeah, could I pick up on that?
Of course.
Because I think one of the key learnings that we have from actually having a more formal classification in some of the countries is that even a partial adoption of the standards makes a huge difference for the quality and clarity of the information in the projects. So even though that a lot of the newer systems, like the ones that Chris is referring to, is very complex and a complex rules for type coding and reference systems and stuff like that. But I sometimes see this being a hinge for actually getting started. But you don't need to implement everything. You can do it gradually. On the hospital project, they started out just working with classification and then added upon that. So they agreed upon a standard and then they implemented the different ways of working with the standard in various ways. And often we see the building owners actually setting the requirements. Probably most of the time it's regulated by demand, but other times it's actually by an initiative, like it is often for the general contractors as well. So I see a lot of benefit of actually just starting on that.
Interesting. Keiward, anything you would like to add from your perspective? I mean, as you sort of look, I guess, more at a high level and sort of the output from it.
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway a little bit of this is that there's just hearing what you're saying, and looking at how the construction industry looks today and how inefficient it is today, I can just imagine how much savings and not only in financial terms, but also from a sustainability perspective, which is important to us. That I think that with this you can also have lots of savings, both in terms of material, in terms of time, resources, and also in terms of, and maybe that's also a question for you when you talk about the different building parts, that doesn't this also enable and influence the purchase of building parts and how the building itself can be more environmentally friendly from a carbon footprint perspective as well. This should enable information and be more transparent and provide clarity about the carbon footprint of the building as well. At least that's the question I have for you.
Yeah, maybe I can answer on that part. Yeah, definitely. I'm quite sure that a good and well implemented classification is the key for gaining the necessary structure that you need to have when you need to navigate in all these needed information for collecting and documenting sustainability data. So if we should compare anything, we can see that from some of the general contractors, they are using this to internal planning and for cost optimization and looking across the portfolio of different projects. So you can actually compare how different objects or materials perform on the different projects. But it's very hard if you don't know which kind of objects or which kind of classification has been used in the different projects. So I think it's key for actually making sure that we know what we're talking about, and then we can start adding all this information, and we see from this standard perspective that this is what is going to happen over the next coming years. But we see standards that actually are going to help us make sure that we work in the same way with the properties and property values and stuff like that. So we cannot Google everything in it, but this is definitely a big help for that part.
Yeah, and one thing that strikes me, I mean, I come originally from the telecoms industry, where standardization is of course key, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to make phone calls, connect to the internet and things like that. You here talk about different standards. Is that an issue that they are not, or are they sort of compatible with each other if you have slightly different standards in the different countries?
Yeah, they are compatible in some ways, and they have different, as the slide actually shows you as well, there's different purposes for them. Some years ago, I think that I probably assumed that we needed to work on the same classification with everybody, but it's not going to happen. No. Not even in the Nordics, we have different variations of the same international or ISO standard. But I think that's okay, and that's also why we need to have some kind of system that can actually do this kind of mapping between, and that is my main focus within Symetri, to make sure that we can add this kind of services to our customers to help them when they're working in different software systems and working with different standards. Because that will happen. Yeah.
Interesting. Another, I think you touched upon it, Keiward and Nicolai, but also Chris. I mean, with the classification and the standardizations, it becomes more transparent, and the data becomes a bit more open, I guess. And is that the challenge that, you know, you can't hide perhaps any longer? I don't know. Or is it? Sometimes if it's data is open and available and transparent, that could sometimes perhaps cause concerns, or is it just for the good?
From my perspective, it's good in some way, but if you take a look at some very big contractors who's all over the world on different building projects, for instance, we have some Italian at our project. They are used to use other standards in their project. So for instance, the CCI, which is an European standard, hopefully soon, it's very important to, let's say, the common language in our model or construction site and so on. We need to use it in the same way, but sometimes there's different way to read the name of a classification code for every country, let's say. Okay. So. But I think it's important to have this, and I'm talking a lot of data in our organization where we need to use the same term every time we are talking about data in the same column. But it's hard for someone to understand, but we need to get everyone, not just the BIM and ICT people or the technical people into this. We need everyone to have understanding about it before we can get the perfect result of this. For us, we're using it as well on the construction side. When someone are doing taking a look at something that's made wrong and they are going to take a note, we are actually using the CSS code there as well, because we need to talk about the same. We don't need to talk about a concrete column in 10 different ways. For example, they are doing the concrete column for a short code, or they are typing, they are written it in 10 different ways. Then we are using the CSS code instead, so we are talking about the same. So when we are processing the data after the building is done, we can figure out what node this is about, instead of we have to figure out in 10 different ways. If you understand.
Yeah, I think so.
So not just using the CSS code in the modeling process, but we are using it in the way that we can. So we are very wide. We are very open for using it in different ways.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sounds very good. I see time is running, always with interesting, discussions. Any final questions from the audience?
Yeah, I can see there's one for
Yeah.
Krista Johansson. I think he's put it in the Q&A,
yeah.
so that's great.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the short answer is yes. You should always use the most appropriate classification for the purpose you have. Systems like co-class that is referring to is kind of based on the same standard as CCS and CCI is. It's a new way of working with this, and I will think that in 99% it will cover the different purposes that you would have in a project. But in some cases, we can see like we have the Pham, the new bridge between Denmark and Germany. The CCI standard wasn't sufficient enough, so they needed to add some additional classes. So we can say that we have a kind of a bit more purpose-built classification for that project. 98% of the classes are based on the international standard, but they had to add a bit because of this kind of infrastructure project that needed to do things a bit differently. And we will see that usually some of these standards are only updated every 50 year or something like that. No co-classes is probably going to be one time every year or even sooner than that. But then you can adopt these learnings that you do when you start implementing these. Some of these are very new, but I think the key thing is that, yes, you need to look into how is this going to be used.
Yeah. So many thanks. And I can see that we I don't think we have any more questions, right? No, we don't. So just a quick question, because then we need to end. Do you think the future is bright, and will this develop even further the coming years? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Definitely.
I kind of, sort of, I got that. So now, thanks a lot. I'm just gonna double check the agenda. It's now time for the sponsor talks, so you can go back and to the session rooms and sort of go and look which one you would actually like to join. And as we already said, all of these will be recorded and we will share them afterwards. So thanks to Chris, Nicolai, and Keiward, and thanks for the audience for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.